For changing the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor, and every once in a while somebody says, well, what does ISO mean? It's not important, okay? But it does stand for International Standards Organization, and it basically means ISO 100 on this Nikon is the same as it is on a Canon or Pentax or Fuji or something else. It's just a standard that they have that everyone adheres to. And so by pressing the ISO button and turning the command dial, you can dial through the different ISOs, and they'll start at ISO 100, they'll go up to ISO 6400. But as you can see by the list on screen with the little red asterisk marks, you can actually go beyond that. You do need to go into the menu system to kind of turn on these little locks that are currently on the camera. So there's a low set, low 1, and when it says low 1, what that means is it's one stop lower than ISO 100, which would be 50. And they could just simply put 50 there, but they don't, and I don't know why. Same thing on the high. High 1 is double 6400, so it's 12,800. High 2 is 25,600, and they could just simply put the numbers there. Now, one thing you can also do is press the ISO button and turn the sub-command dial out in the front of the camera to turn the auto setting on and off. In auto ISO, the camera will go up and down and use whatever ISO it thinks is necessary in order for taking pictures. And this could work well in the program mode where the camera is just going to do everything. It might work well in the shutter priority mode, as I mentioned before, where you have a very specific shutter speed that you were going after, and you just want to let the ISO waver a little bit in a certain range to figure out the rest of it. Now, one of the things that you can also do in ISO is you can limit in auto ISO how high up it goes, and you can also dictate as to what shutter speeds you'll let the camera go down to before it starts changing the ISO. So for anyone who really wants to customize auto ISO, you'll see more in just a second. But I did do some test shooting with this camera, and I just take my little standard little micro camera, shoot a picture of it, blow it up, and shoot it at a bunch of different ISOs. And so just in case you can't see the screen real clearly, you are going to have fantastic quality results from ISO 100 up through 800. Let's just go up to the top of the line and look at 25,000. There it is definitely what we call a little crunchy. It's noisy. The signal is being amplified a lot. There's not a lot of good information. You're not going to get good image quality at 25,000. If you have to use it, you have to use it. But I would really try to avoid it. 12,800 is still pretty rough. 6,400 looks amazingly good for 24 megapixel camera on a cropped frame sensor. Still, for those who really want the finest quality details, say you're doing portrait photography or you're doing landscape photography, you're definitely going to want to keep it down probably around 1,600 or lower. The easy and simple fact with all of this is that the lower the number, the better. With the exception of going from 100 down to 50. You want to get down to 100. And so in photography, it's just a little bit of a game. You start at 100, you go up as necessary, and it just gets a little bit worse with each step up that you go. I see, Nick, you have a microphone in hand. Did you have a question that you were ready for right now?
Just a minor question, I guess, in regards to the lighting that would be available for that style of picture. Is that mainly going to be affected greatly by the ISO? Like if, you were talking about the shutter speed and everything with your ISO, where is that going to be best placed at so far? What if it's, a little bit darker and the ISO is on auto or something? Where would it mostly kind of go towards?
I'm not 100% certain on your question. Let me try to guess where you're going. Well, it depends on kind of where you're set on shutter speed, aperture, and what's being automatically taken care of. The camera's auto ISO is always just looking at the camera's light meter, and it's trying to average out whatever it's looking at as middle-toned gray. And if it's black, it actually tries to lighten black up to a gray, and you might see even more noise in that. I'm not sure. How would this apply to actual shooting?
It's almost like digitally enhancing it?
Yeah. And so what's actually happening is a lot of people think that when they put their camera at ISO 3200, their sensor is more sensitive to light, and that's not the case. Their sensor is always the same sensitivity. It's just amplifying the signal. It's kind of like an old TV. If you're too young to know this, but old TVs had a brightness knob on it that you could turn up the brightness and just make it brighter.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Okay.
No, I do, for sure. We had one of the dial ones.
Yeah, well, the old dial, you're just turning up the brightness, and that's what it's doing is it's just turning up the signal that the TV received. It's not making the actual picture brighter. I mean, what you see is brighter.
It was just more of a question of, is light still affecting that more,
It could happen
levels?
under any light. You could shoot 25,000 out in bright sunlight and see the same problem. It'll become more noticeable in shadow areas. And so
only because of the blacks that
you're going to notice it
available.
in the blacks more,
Okay.
where there's even less light. Yeah. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about customizing ISO. We'll talk a little bit about noise reduction because the camera has a built-in option to reduce the noise if you have to shoot up at high levels, but you can also do it manually in other programs like Lightroom or Photoshop, for instance. But these are the basic controls for the ISO, and where you shoot depends on exactly your shooting. For most people who are trying to get the highest quality pictures out of their camera, they're going to leave it at ISO 100, and they're going to stick to ISO 100 as much of the time as they can. And so for myself, I'm at ISO 100 maybe 50 or 60% of the time, but for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into in this class, I'll put it up to 200 or 400 because I'm trying to achieve a different shutter speed or aperture and I have to. But with the camera, I would feel quite comfortable shooting everything up through 800 and still pretty comfortable at 1632 and 6400. It just all depends on where you want to draw that line.
So is the low, Mango 7 has asked, how do I access the ISO 50 setting? I'm assuming that that's equivalent to the low 1?
ISO 50, low 1 are exactly the same thing.
Okay.
And to access it, you got to stick with the class. And you got to follow through to the menu settings because in one of the menu settings, we can go in and we can kind of take off these little locks that are on the restrictions. Right now, they don't allow you into that mode, and you have to go in and turn off those locks. And so we'll do that in the menu setting.
And Barnacle asks, is there any way to display on top both the ISO setting and the frames remaining?
When you turn on the special mode that I talked about before that shows you the ISO, it will switch back to the frames. I believe, my camera's not set up right now for it, but I believe it'll switch back to frames left when you press down on the shutter release. And so it's ISO, and then it switches over to remaining frames. And so, yes, it will show you both, but just not at the same time.
Great. And I think we can move on.
Okay, excellent. All right, so the I button is a brand new button on Nikon cameras, so we're going to see this I button, my guess, is on all new Nikon cameras. And Nikon has put this in there to have a little bit more direct access control to some of the features. Those coming from, say, Canon have a Q button, and it kind of does the same thing. What it is it's a shortcut to some menu features. It's also just another way to jump in and make some changes on the camera. And it works differently in different modes. We haven't talked about live view yet. We're going to do it in a moment. But when you have your camera turned on in live view mode, if you press the I button, you can see a list on screen here of the different options and features that you can go in and turn on and turn off. And we're not going to go in and talk about all these right now. We've already talked about image size and image quality. We'll talk about the other ones as we get through the camera. But it's a shortcut to some of the menu features that we'll be going into. If you are in the playback mode and you're looking at an image, you can hit the I button and you can go into the retouch menu. This is where you Photoshop your images, and you can crop them and do all sorts of goofy things with them. And so that's the second option. And the third option is if you are in the movie mode, you can control image area and the rest of the list that you can see on screen here. All of these things are things that you can change in the menu setting. It's just that the I info is a shortcut to going in and changing these. And so we'll talk about these features in due time. All right, along the top of the camera, we do have a removable eye cup. Sometimes these wear out with years of good service, so you can go out and you can buy a new little eye cup. And your camera will come supplied with this little DK5. And the reason it's there is if you want to do a self-timer shot with the camera in program, aperture priority, or shutter priority. And let me show you on the camera here. The problem is that when you're shooting a picture in, let's say, aperture priority, you have light coming in the front of the lens. You also have light coming in the back of the lens. When you hold it up to your eye, it's not a problem because your eye is blocking the light coming in. But when you decide to be in the picture yourself, either for self-timer shots or if it's on a tripod and light's coming in the back, it may affect your exposure. And so you're supposed to block it off. If you're right there, you can just put your hand up, but if you're doing a self-timer, you're supposed to put this on here. I always find it a hassle to take the eye cup off and use this piece, so I just put my camera in manual and set my shutter speed and aperture to what's correct. So there's always more than one way around it. But that's why you got that little gadget. Next up is the diopter. Diopter is the focusing of the viewfinder. It's not focusing of the lens. It's just the viewfinder that you are looking through. And so you want to make sure that you can turn this dial and you want to be able to see the lines of information at the bottom of the frame really clearly. And if it's not quite right, just adjust that diopter for your eyes. The one major, I call it the thumb button, because you hit it with your thumb very easily, is the AEL-AFL, which stands for Auto Exposure Lock and or Auto Focus Lock. What this does is it's going to lock the exposure or focus depending on what mode you're in. Normally right now, when you pick the camera up and just pan it around, the exposure is constantly adjusting. If you want to lock it in, what you would do is you would press the button. And let me just give this a little try here. I'll make sure I'm in aperture priority. And I press it in, and it is active only when I am pressing in on the button right now. That's the way it's pre-programmed, is I have to hold my finger in on the button. Remember, Nikon likes you to hold the button down. So in that case, if I want to lock the exposure in, I have to hold it in while I take the picture. The reason that you might use this, let's say you're shooting a sunset, and you got the camera pointed at the sun and it's really, really bright and it's throwing off your exposure. So you move the camera a little off to the side, you lock the exposure, and then you bring the sun back in the frame the way you want it framed up, and then you take the picture. And so you have to lock the exposure in and then take the picture. Now you can also get it to lock the focus. We're going to talk about focus in a moment. If you have the camera in a continuous focusing mode and you want it to stop, you can hold the button in as well. Now, one of the nice things about this button is that you can go in and program it, either by going into the custom menu, or you can get to that through a shortcut in the I button. You can go in and customize the AEL-AFL button, and there's about 5 different options that you can program it to. And one of the modes that a lot of professionals and serious photographers like to use is to turn off the AEL-AFL, because they're using manual mode, and if you shoot manual, the autofocus, auto exposure lock doesn't really matter that much. And they turn this into an autofocus on button. So you would activate the focusing by pressing your thumb in the back of the camera. That way when you take the picture, the camera doesn't focus. And so you need 2 fingers to focus. And this is really nice in a variety of situations where you're focusing and recomposing. You don't have to constantly readjust the camera. And it's not something for everybody. It takes a little while to get used to, but it is a little bit more advanced technique that, frankly, I didn't think I would like, but once I got using it for a while, I'm a big proponent of it now. And so something to experiment if you're on the slightly more advanced side. Downside is that you have to press 2 buttons to focus. Downside is that you don't have to refocus. So have some fun playing with that if you want. Next up, we have our command dial. We have already talked quite a bit about that. We have our multi-selector, which we've dealt with before, but the main reason we're using the multi-selector in the shooting mode is for changing where our focusing point is. We have 51 focusing points, and we can choose individually where we want that point to be, and we can just go up, down, left, right to move that focusing point around. In the playback mode, it's going to work with the retouch menu. And in the menus, it's, actually I'm talking about the OK button, excuse me. If you press the OK button in the shooting mode, it's going to go straight to the center point. The multi-selector will allow you to go to different points. When you're in the playback mode, it'll activate the retouch menu, pressing the OK button. And then in all the menus, it's just confirming the setting. And if you want to, you can go in the custom menu and you can customize exactly what does the OK button do or not do in its different modes. If you accidentally press that button from time to time and you don't want it to do something, you can turn that off, which can be handy. For people like myself who are left eye and their nose hits the OK button when you're holding the camera. I'm goofy-eyed. If you're right-eyed, you're correct. If you're left-eyed like me, you're wrong. Okay, next up, the whole indicator, that little multi-selector, does get hit by people like me with the left eye, and there is a selector lock at the bottom, which you can swing over to the side and you can lock the multi-selector so that you don't accidentally reposition the focusing point all the time. And so, nice little locking device. Just with your thumb back and forth, right? Yeah. All right, next up.
Really quick, Stephen in the chat room says that there are a lot of questions about back focus or about back button focusing.
Oh boy.
Bruce J67 asks, can you use the back button focus and still keep the AFL feature?
No. That's one of the problems with this, is that there's only one button. If you want two buttons, there is another couple of cameras higher up in the Nikon lineup, the D600, the D800. They have the extra two buttons, but you have one button and you got to make some serious choices with it.
So you can't have an autofocus.
We got to have the microphone. So it sounds like a good question, so grab the microphone.
All right, so you can't have the autofocus from the shutter button and the focus lock on? Are those, can that count as the two different buttons?
Those two you can do. Okay, so you can't.
But that's if it's not customized, like you went through the menu.
So if you customize this to be autofocus lock, I'm trying to think if you could customize the shutter release to be exposure lock, and I don't think you can. There are some cameras that you can. And so the implications would be you can do focus lock with the back button. It's really sophisticated. You press down to focus, and you take your finger off to lock, because then it stops focusing. I know the Seahawks photographer was explaining a technique that he uses. He uses back button focusing for sports. And he's shooting the scene, and when a referee or a player gets between him and his subject, he releases his finger off the focusing button, still shooting pictures because something might happen kind of in between as it's slightly obscured. When the obstruction gets out of the way, he returns to pressing on the button, which is a very good technique. He's good. I mean, this is the equivalent of a pianist, the very hard, finger dexterity, timing it to the second, that requires a lot of practice to get it done right. And so you can use that for a focusing lock in that manner.